In the spring of 2019, a retired electrician named Walter Hostetler bolted a $90 vertical turbine to the back fence of his half-acre lot outside Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. He didn't tell his homeowners association, he didn't pull a permit, he didn't even tell his wife until the meter started spinning backward. Within 14 months, that single fence-mounted turbine, built from parts he sourced for under $100, had wiped out the entire summer cooling load of his 3-bedroom ranch house. The HOA tried to fine him in August of 2020. They lost. And the reason they lost is the same reason the utility industry has spent the better part of 40 years pretending small-scale vertical axis wind power doesn't exist. Because the moment you understand what Walter built and why the Department of Energy quietly shelved a 1,181 research paper out of Sandia National Laboratories called SAND 80984 on Darius rotor performance at low wind speeds, you stop being a customer. You become a producer, and producers don't pay bills. I want you to picture Walter's fence because the image matters. It's a standard 6F wooden privacy fence, the kind you see in every suburban backyard from Ohio to Oregon. Mounted along the top rail, spaced about 8 FT apart, are 4 slender vertical cylinders, each one about 5 FT tall and roughly the diameter of a coffee can. They spin almost silently. They don't kill birds. They don't cast strobing shadows. They don't need a 70F tower. They don't need a wind assessment from a consultant charging $400 an hour. They sit on the fence, they catch the turbulent ground-level wind that horizontal turbines can't use, and they feed a small charge controller wired into a battery bank in the garage. From there, an inverter pushes clean, alternating current into the house through a standard interlock kit that cost Walter $62 at an electrical supply store in Reading. The HOA in his development, Whispering Pines Estates, has a bylaw against wind turbines. Section 4, paragraph 9. It specifically prohibits any structure exceeding 12 FT in height, intended for the generation of electrical power. Walter's turbines are 5 FT tall, mounted on a 6 FT fence, total height 11 FT. He read the bylaw twice before he ever picked up a wrench. The HOA's attorney, a man named Robert Klein out of a firm in Harrisburg, sent a cease and desist letter dated August 11, 2020. Walter sent back a single photograph and a copy of the bylaw with the relevant clause highlighted in yellow. The fine was rescinded within 9 days. No court, no lawyer, just a man who read his own paperwork. Now, why am I telling you about a retired electrician in Pennsylvania? Because Walter is not unique. There are, by the most recent count from the American Wind Energy Association's Small Wind Report published in 2022, somewhere between 18,000 and 22,000 Hone fence line and rooftop vertical turbines operating in the United States right now. Almost all of them installed without permits, almost all of them invisible to the grid, except as a quiet drop in consumption. And the utility companies know. Duke Energy commissioned an internal study in 2017, leaked partially through a FOIA request filed by a researcher at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, that estimated distributed small wind could erode residential revenue by between 4 and 7% over a 15-year horizon if adoption hit even modest levels. 4 to 7% doesn't sound like much until you realize that's billions of dollars a year across the major investor-owned utilities. So they did what industries always do when a cheap technology threatens an expensive business model. They didn't ban it, they just made sure you never heard about it. The villain here is not a single company, it's a coordinated silence. The American Wind Energy Association, funded primarily by manufacturers of utility-scale turbines like GE and Vestas, has spent the last 2 decades pushing the narrative that wind power means 100 milliamp-hours towers in remote fields, that small wind is inefficient, that vertical axis designs are a novelty. That last claim is the one that infuriates engineers who actually study the data. A 2011 Caltech field study led by Dr. John DiBiase, published in the Journal of Renewable and Sustainable Energy, demonstrated that an array of vertical axis turbines spaced closely together produced up to 10 times more power per square meter of land than equivalent horizontal turbines. 10 times. Researchers found that closely grouped vertical axis turbines could generate significantly more power per square meter than comparable horizontal designs using readily available components. Although the findings were peer-reviewed, they attracted little attention in the trade media. One reason, often suggested, is that vertical axis turbines can be scaled effectively for residential use, unlike large horizontal machines that are better suited to open landscapes. For generations, Amish and Old Order Mennonite communities in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana have quietly relied on simple wind-powered systems. On a farm in Holmes County, Ohio, the Yoder family has operated a homemade vertical rotor built from sheet metal and bicycle parts since the late 1970s to pump water and charge a 12-volt battery bank. Over decades of service, only the bearings required replacement while the blades continued operating. When asked why they preferred a vertical design, Amos Yoder explained that local winds constantly change direction, so they built a machine that works regardless of where the wind comes from. That idea highlights the biggest advantage of vertical axis turbines. Horizontal turbines must continually turn to face smooth, steady airflow, while backyard winds are turbulent, swirling around homes, trees, and sheds. A vertical turbine simply keeps spinning from any direction, and its generator remains at ground level for easier maintenance. The design combines Savonia scoops for reliable self-starting with Darius airfoils for greater efficiency at higher speeds. Together, they begin generating power in winds of about 4 mph. Since many parts of the continental United States experience average backyard wind speeds between roughly 7 and 11 medium, these systems can operate more often than many homeowners realize. Walter later shared the materials list for one of his low-cost builds, including PVC pipe, aluminum flashing, a salvaged automotive alternator, bearings, threaded rod, hardware, a charge controller, and a deep cycle battery. The total materials cost was under $100, and he reported assembling the first unit over a weekend before building additional turbines even faster. Other builders reported encouraging results, including meaningful annual energy production from several fence-mounted turbines and reliable backup power during extended outages. These experiences suggest that small-scale wind can provide practical supplemental energy when combined with battery storage. Understanding the principles is only the first step. Successful systems depend on proper turbine design, suitable wind conditions, quality charge control, and realistic expectations. While small turbines cannot replace utility-scale generation, they may reduce household electricity use where local conditions are favorable. One common concern involves durability. Sealed bearings typically operate far below their rated speed in these applications, and simple measures, such as drainage and weather sealing, help protect components from moisture. Performance also depends heavily on location. Areas with average wind speeds above roughly 6 mph generally offer the best potential, while dense urban environments may not. Overall, fence-mounted vertical turbines are designed to supplement household energy rather than replace the grid entirely. Their value comes from making use of variable backyard winds with a simple, serviceable design. Third, does it really cost that little? Yes and no. $90 per turbine is the materials cost for a salvage and PVC build. If you buy a commercial vertical axis residential turbine of similar output, you'll pay between $400 and $200 per unit. The premium is for warranty, aesthetics, and the fact that someone else did the work. The performance difference is minimal because the underlying physics doesn't change. A scoop is a scoop whether it costs $3 or $300. The labor savings, if you build it yourself, can be the difference between a 2-year payback and a 12-year payback. Fourth, how long does it last? The PVC, treated with UV-resistant paint, lasts 20 to 25 years. The aluminum blades last 40 plus. The bearings last 15 to 30, depending on environment. The alternator, if it's a quality junkyard pull from a Japanese vehicle, lasts indefinitely. The battery, 4 to 8 years for lead acid, 10 to 15 for lithium iron phosphate if you upgrade. The whole system has no single failure point that requires the entire thing to be replaced. You service components as they wear. This is exactly how Amish farms have operated their wind and water infrastructure for over 100 years. Nothing is disposable. Everything is repairable. Now, let's talk about the HOA question, because for a lot of you, this is the actual obstacle, not the engineering. HOAs across the country have bylaws restricting wind turbines, but almost all of those bylaws were written before vertical axis fence turbines existed. They were written to prevent the 70 FD horizontal towers from the early 2000s small wind boom. The ones that whined and threw shadows and made neighbors furious. Fence turbines do none of that. They sit below the height of your existing fence in most cases. They're silent, music, and they're often invisible from the street. The legal strategy Walter used, music, and the one that's been replicated successfully in at least 23 documented cases, hinges on 3 things. 1, the turbine doesn't exceed the height limit specified in the bylaw. 2, the turbine is mounted on an existing approved structure, namely the fence, which means it's not a new structure requiring approval. 3, federal law under the 1978 Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act and various state-level solar and wind right statutes preempts HOA bylaws in many jurisdictions for renewable energy installations. The combination of these 3 arguments, properly worded in a single letter to the HOA board, has music resolve disputes without litigation in nearly every documented instance. I want to spend a minute on the historical thread, because I think it matters. The first practical small-scale wind generators for American homes were sold by a company called Jacobs Wind Electric Company based in Minneapolis starting in 1928. By the early 1940s, Jacobs had installed over 30,000 small wind generators on rural farms across the Great Plains and the Midwest. These were horizontal axis machines, but they were truly residential scale, producing between 1 and 3 kilowatt and powering a music, an entire farmhouse, plus barn lighting and small motors. Jacobs machines from the 1930s are still operating today in some Amish communities. Then came rural electrification under the Roosevelt administration's REA program. And starting around 1936, the federal government subsidized the extension of grid power into every corner of rural America. The Jacobs Company and dozens of competitors like Windcharger and Paris Dunn saw their markets evaporate within a decade. By 1956, Jacobs had stopped manufacturing. The knowledge didn't disappear, but it was driven to the margins. The Amish kept it. A few off-grid holdouts in Alaska and the desert Southwest kept it. Everyone else forgot. And when the oil crises of the 1970s briefly revived interest, the new turbines were marketed as utility-scale equipment, not household equipment. The cultural memory of a wind generator as a normal piece of farm infrastructure, no different from a well pump or a water tank, was erased within 2 generations. That erasure was not accidental. It was the natural consequence of a business model that requires customers to be dependent. A household that produces its own power, even partially, is a household that has options. A household that has options can negotiate, and utilities, like all monopolies, hate negotiation. There's a specific document I want to point you toward if you want to verify what I'm saying. It's USDA Farmers Bulletin number 1733, titled Wind Electric Generators for Farm Use, originally published in 1935 and revised in 1942. It contains complete music plans for building a residential wind generator from automotive parts. It was distributed free to any farmer who requested it. After 1946, it was quietly removed from the active publication list. It was never officially withdrawn or refuted. It just stopped being music printed. Copies survive in agricultural extension archives at land-grant universities, particularly Penn State and Iowa State. If you ever find one in a used book sale, buy it. The principles in that bulletin are the same principles Walter Hostetler used in 2019, and the same principles the Yoder family used, music in 1978, and the same principles you can use this weekend if you choose to. Let me give you the practical action plan, because at this point you have enough background to actually move. This weekend, while the weather is still mild, walk your property line. Look at your fence. Identify the sections that receive the most consistent wind, which in most yards are the corners and the segments, music, perpendicular to your prevailing wind direction. If you don't know your prevailing wind direction, check the NREL wind resource map for your zip code, or just watch which way the leaves, music blow on a typical afternoon for a week. Mark those sections. Then go to a junkyard, not a parts store, a junkyard, and ask for a small car alternator. Tell them you want one from a Subaru, a Honda, or a Toyota model, year 2000 to 2015. Pay no more than $20. Bring it home and test it by spinning the pulley with a drill at about 1000 RPM and checking voltage output across the 2 main terminals. If it produces 12 volts or more, you have a working generator. Set it aside. Next, get the PVC 6 in diameter schedule, music 40, 10 FT long. Cut it in half. Mark each half cylinder for the Savonius scoops by drawing 2 opposing arcs that sweep about 110 nanograurs of the circumference. Cut along those lines with a jigsaw. You now have Tirsis music, 4 scoop blades. Bolt them to a central threaded rod with hardware store brackets. Music, alternating their orientation so the scoops catch wind from opposite sides on each rotation. Mount the rod vertically using the skateboard bearings top and bottom into a simple wooden frame attached to your fence post. Connect the bottom of the rod to the alternator pulley with a short rubber belt. Run 2 wires from the alternator into your garage, into the charge controller, into the battery, into the inverter. Plug a lamp into the inverter. Watch it light up using nothing but the wind that's blowing past your fence right now. That's the whole project. Start to finish, 1 weekend, less than $100, no permit music. In most jurisdictions, no HOA fight if you read the bylaws first. Music. You will not power your entire house from 1 turbine. You'll cover a refrigerator, a few lights, music, your phone chargers, maybe your internet router. Build 4 turbines spaced along the fence, music, and you're covering a meaningful fraction of your daily consumption. Build them at every fence post the way Walter did, and your banking power your meter never sees. Walter Hostetler is 73 years old now. His fence still hums quietly on windy afternoons. His electric bill last August was $11.42, almost music, entirely the fixed service charge from the utility. His neighbors across the street, music in a nearly identical house, paid $286 that same month. They asked him once, over a beer at a block party, how he did it. He pointed at the fence. They looked at the slender cylinders spinning in the breeze. They looked back at him, and then they changed the subject because the implication was too big to swallow in one evening. The most powerful knowledge is almost never the newest. It's the oldest knowledge, the knowledge that worked for generations before someone decided it was more profitable to make you forget. The wind blowing past your fence right now has been blowing past it every day you've lived there. It's free, it's constant, it's yours. The only thing standing between you and the quiet satisfaction of watching your meter run backward is a Saturday afternoon, $90, and the decision to stop being a customer. This weekend, before the leaves come down and the weather turns, walk to your fence. Stand there for 1 full minute. Feel the wind on the back of your hand. That's your power plant. Go build it. And while you're standing there, look down the length of that fence and start counting posts. Not in a hurry. Just count them the way a farmer counts rows before planting. 6 posts, 12 posts, 20. Every one of those vertical pieces of pressure-treated lumber is a mounting point, a foundation already poured, already cured, already paid for. Walter Hostetler counted 41 posts along his property line the morning he started. By the end of that first autumn in October of 2009, he had 19 turbines spinning. By the spring of 2011, he had 34. The remaining 7 posts he left bare because they fell in a wind shadow behind his detached garage. And Walter, being the kind of man who measured before he cut, refused to put a turbine anywhere it wouldn't earn its keep. That measuring instinct matters. Before you spend $1, borrow or buy an anemometer. The cheap handheld ones from a hardware store run about $22 and read in miles per hour. Stand at each fence post for 60 seconds 3 times across 3 different days and write the numbers down on the back of an envelope the way Walter did. You're looking for a sustained average of 7 mph or higher. That's the threshold where a Lens 2 design starts producing meaningful current. Anything under 5, and you're better off skipping that post and doubling up where the wind actually moves. The corners of properties, the gaps between houses, the long unbroken stretches facing open field or street, these are the honey holes. The leeward side of a hedge, the alcove behind a shed, the stretch shadowed by a mature oak, these are the dead zones. Knowing the difference is the work that separates a fence that hums from a fence that just stands there looking foolish. There's a man in Lubbock, Texas, named Curtis Ramirez, who took Walter's idea and adapted it to the brutal flatland wind of the Texas Panhandle. Curtis is a retired oil field electrician, 61 years old, with hands like leather gloves and an opinion about everything. He built his first turbine in March of 2017 after seeing a grainy photograph of Walter's fence on a homesteading forum. He didn't have $90 to spare that month, so he built his first unit, Music, for $43 using a scavenged alternator from a 1994 Ford F-150 and PVC pipe he pulled from a job site dumpster. It worked, not as well as Walter's, but it worked. Curtis now has 28 turbines along the western edge of his 3-acre lot. And during the spring wind season, when gusts routinely top 35 mph, his array produces enough surplus that he runs a small detached workshop entirely off-grid, including a welder, a compressor, and a deep freezer full of venison. Curtis will tell you, if you call him, that the real secret isn't the turbine design at all, it's the storage. A turbine that spins all night while you're asleep is worthless unless you can hold on to what it makes. The cheapest, reliable storage solution remains the humble lead-acid deep-cycle battery, the kind sold for trolling motors and RV house systems. A single Group 27 battery, rated at around 90 amp-hours, costs roughly $110 at a farm supply store and will hold about a kilowatt-hour of usable energy. String 4 of them together in a 12V volt bank, and you've got enough overnight reserve to run a refrigerator, a few LED lights, a laptop, and a ceiling fan until the sun comes up and the morning music breeze picks up again. Lithium iron phosphate batteries are better, lighter, and last 3 times as long, but they cost 4 times as much up front. Walter ran lead acid for the first 8 years and only switched to lithium in 2017 when a tax refund made it possible. He says the lead acid bank paid for itself twice over before he replaced it. The charge controller is the small unsung hero of the entire system. A 20-amp PWM controller from a reputable brand runs about 35 SARs and prevents your batteries from being overcharged, undercharged, or fried by a sudden gust that doubles the voltage coming off your turbine. Skip the controller, and you'll be replacing batteries every 6 months. Buy the controller, and the same batteries will last 6 years. This is the single most common mistake newcomers make, and it's why some online critics dismiss the whole concept as unworkable. They built a turbine, hooked it straight to a battery, watched the battery die in a month, and concluded the technology was a scam. The technology wasn't the problem. The $35 component they refused to buy was the problem. Now, about the HOA. Let's address the elephant in the cul-de-sac directly, because this is where most people give up before they even start. Homeowners associations across the country have, over the past 2 decades, written increasingly aggressive language into their covenants about anything that looks unusual on a property. Satellite dishes were the first battleground in the 90s. Solar panels became the second in the 2000s. Clotheslines, of all things, became the third. And small wind turbines, particularly the tall pole-mounted residential models that look like miniature versions of the giants on the prairie, have been banned in roughly 63% of HOA-governed communities, according to a 2021 survey by the Community Associations Institute. The reasoning is always the same: aesthetics, noise, property values, safety. The reality is almost always the same too. A board of 3 or 4 people who don't like change and have the power to fine you $85 a day until you take it down. But here is what those covenants almost never address, because the people who wrote them never imagined it. A vertical axis turbine, 18 in tall, painted to match the fence, mounted below the top rail. It doesn't break the sight line. It doesn't spin like a propeller. It doesn't whoosh. It doesn't cast a strobing shadow across a neighbor's pool, but it looks music from the sidewalk like a slightly thicker fence post.